Welcome, our beloved and brilliant colleague, Bill. We so appreciate your consistent leadership and solidarity. And as always at SETC, we begin all things by giving thanks to our Creator, by giving thanks and acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We acknowledge all our ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So, Bill, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers and share a bit about your remarkable work, sir?
Well, nice to be here, Victor. Thank you for asking me. And yeah, I'm old, so I guess that there's a danger to this question, if I give you too much detail. But yeah, I started in the private sector, happened to be in the right place at the right time, as I like to say. The Wheel of Fortune spun awfully well for me, and I kind of realized, the Wheel of Fortune doesn't spin well for everybody, and the cards are stacked in favor of certain demographics and certain kinds of profiles, including me, and thought, well, I should take my business experience and I should do something different with it. And I should, if capitalism is here to stay, how do we make it much more inclusive, and how do we think of sort of broadening opportunity and access to wealth and access to income, and what would be the elements of that? And that led to the formation of Social Capital Partners in 2001. It's a nonprofit. I don't know where 23 years went, but it's been kind of a wonderful journey. Also has its elements of frustration, but unlike perhaps what I was doing before I went on this particular journey, I don't have any existential issues in terms of why I'm doing what I'm doing, or questions about where should I focus my time or whatever. So I feel, we'll probably get into some questions about the work and what we do, because it would be long to take you through the 20 odd years, but more recently we've been focused on employee ownership, and that's, why don't I pause there and just see if that's what's the next question before I take too long to bring that one.
No, I always appreciate your candor and the beautiful spirit you bring to this work. My next question is, what's inspiring you right now? What has you curious, or what's keeping you up at nights?
Well, I mean, it is this question of, I think what keeps me up at night is probably what keeps many of us up at night. It's I think we've got a couple of existential questions. I don't know why I'm using existential so much today, but around climate change and wealth inequality. I think those are issues that could fracture, the wealth inequality could fracture our society, and climate change could, make it impossible for all of us to live here much longer. So, I think those are the things that keep me up at night. We've been focused much more on wealth inequality than we have on climate change. I think they're both related. I think I would not, even though we're focused more on sort of wealth inequality issues, and kind of the broader who should own the economy issues, and how do we build pathways to wealth for people who don't have pathways to wealth. I think climate change is a huge, huge issue as well. And I think, like so many of us, those are the things that keep me up at night, and trying to think, how can we and I, be contributors to trying to make this, solve these issues and make them better.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I love the fact that there's always been that intergenerational collaboration model with you. Like, since the first time we met, we've always been someone that we can reach out to connect with, to build with, and to collaborate with. And when we think about those two things that you brought up, climate change, climate action, and the fact that so really we're going through a poly crisis and the wealth inequality, definitely there's a link between industrialization and imperialism and capitalism and the way Asasia, Mother Earth, is reacting to us. But one thing is for sure, she'll be fine. Will our civilization be okay? I think the planet will be okay. It's will we be okay? You know what I mean?
Yeah, the plan will be okay once it gets rid of us if we
Yeah,
don't smarten
there
up.
you go. You know, yeah, you
But
know.
hopefully we can cohabit if we,
Oh,
if we're a little bit smarter about how we do things.
absolutely. I couldn't agree more, sir. I couldn't agree more. So my next question is, in terms of the deep work you're doing around employee ownership, ownership in general, wealth inequality, all the things that social capital partners have been doing, what are some of the challenges and barriers that you faced? And what are some of the approaches that you and your colleagues have taken on to, I guess, mitigate some of these challenges and barriers?
Yeah, and maybe the best way to answer that question is to say, how have we approached it most recently, and how is that influencing how we might change? Because I think we've taken a path that we thought kind of the way to solve this would be to work with the biggest actors in the system, the people who have lots of capital, and to show them there's a different way to do things, and to almost in some ways do their R&D for them, and then say, okay, now you use your capital to do this. And I got to be careful because, of course, I get into these long stories, but one of the things we in our most recent iteration, we said, and this started about 7 or 8 years ago with John Shell joining, and John sort of had a similar background to me, a similar view in terms of, boy, the private sector should be doing a lot more than it's doing, and even though we'd been beneficiaries of it, and we really thought, we have to solve this pathways to wealth issue because it's concentrated in so few hands. And we looked for the best models out there and around the world and did the research and found, to our surprise, that we thought the best model was in the US, where they've had these powerful incentives for 40 years. I mean, who'd have thought you'd find it in the US? For 40 years around creating 100% employee-owned companies. And without getting into too many details, there's a capital gains incentive for business owners to sell to their employees, whereby they don't have to pay capital gains tax. And there's a huge operating tax incentive that if you sell to your employees, those companies pay no income tax. And it's a longer story, but there are now 6,500 of these businesses in the US, thanks to this legislation. They've been around a long time. That means the academics have been able to study them and say, well, how do these businesses compare to their traditionally owned peers? The ones that are owned conventionally by very few shareholders, where all the spoils of profits go to very few. Well, guess what? On every dimension, the employee-owned businesses perform much better. They grow faster and are more profitable than their traditionally owned peers. So our GDP would be better if this was the way our economy was owned and operated. They default less. So this is better for lenders and investors than traditionally owned peers. They stay in their communities longer. They don't move them offshore the way that if it's bought by private equity or one buyer that says, how do I cut costs? Where do I move it? No, they grow in their communities, and it's a community ownership as well as an employee ownership, effectively, because the employees are owners in that community. They lay off fewer people when recessions come, because guess what? Everybody's in it together. There aren't these. And so there's less people on the government payroll, and they pay their employees more before you take into account the wealth that comes from the share ownership. And when you take that into account, they've been this powerful wealth creating engine for people who had no pathways to wealth. There have been 14 million Americans that have been part of these employee-owned companies over those years. It's created $1.8 trillion of wealth in their accounts. That's an average of more than 100,000 per person. But if you take in the anecdotal stories, like one of these grocery companies that was sold 40 years ago for $40 million, now is worth $4 billion. It's created 400 frontline millionaires of people who were stocking shelves or who were cashiers. So, and there's more to it. The beauty of it is employees don't pay. It's a leveraged buyout. There's some complexity to that, but those incentives are what make that work. There's no downside for employees. And we came to the conclusion we needed to do two things. One is we thought with the right kind of financing, this could actually grow much bigger in the US. And the perfect funder for that was pension funds. And no pension fund had ever funded one of those. And again, without getting into the explanation of why that makes sense, we actually brokered this transaction whereby we sold with capital from HOOP, the Healthcare Workers of Ontario Pension Plan, sold Taylor Guitars, the largest acoustic guitar maker in the world, to its 1,400 employees, 700 of whom were Mexicans, interestingly enough. First time Mexicans have ever been included in an employee ownership opportunity from one of these transactions. First time a pension fund has ever funded one of these. And we wanted to parlay this. This is a long way of getting to my point about we try and partner with the private sector. We said, okay, pension funds, we've proven to you that this is a great opportunity because you didn't have to make any, you're the one lending the money for this transaction and you're getting your risk adjusted rates, but you're also starting to drive a much better opportunity for so many more people. And by the way, pension funds, aren't you the stewards of the wealth of the 99%? Like, shouldn't this be right up your alley? And shouldn't you want to do this more? And our belief was, if we could marry that capital with this opportunity, we could change the market share, because despite the success in the US, only 1% approximately of all the sales of businesses go this route. And we thought, boy, if you got institutional capital, which wasn't playing a role, you could change that market share to 15 or 20%, and you could. So you can see I get enthusiastic about this. I believe you could do a lot more of this. We then went to pension funds saying, we wanted to start this large fund to actually do this. It's a long story, but we didn't succeed. And here's my belief in terms of why we didn't succeed, is because a lot of these institutions want to stay in their lanes. They want to just move as much as they're forced to, but not more by, kind of external pressures on this kind of thing. And it's led us to believe that maybe instead of working with these large institutional capital and putting things, like I like to say, on a silver platter for them, that they should be so enthusiastic about, I'm puzzled why, the light bulb didn't go on in sort of a dramatic way like it does for me and us. To maybe we should be looking more at public policy and regulation, because the other thing we did was said, well, Canada doesn't have these incentives. It doesn't have the enabling legislation or the incentives around employee ownership. And here we were trying to build back better. So we said, let's make that our second thrust, to try and make sure that we can get enabling legislation and incentives in Canada to do more of these transactions, make it easier for business owners to sell to their employees. So we see this as the way our economy is owned and operated. And as I pointed out, it has all kinds of ancillary benefits for GDP, for investors, for communities, but it creates pathways to wealth for people who don't have pathways. And we had some success with that, and that may be indicating what our next thrust will be, because we might be focusing, we are going to be focusing more on public policy, trying to think, okay, where can we use public policy and maybe regulation to push some of these actors to be more, involved in making our communities better, making our economy better, making it work for more people, and not thinking of themselves as passive actors in those where all they're trying to do is make the best returns for their stockholders. And that's why we've brought on Matthew Mendelson, who has a huge amount of experience in this, and it's probably a signal that our direction is going to go more towards the public policy regulation. Social Capital Partners has this history of really digging in on something for 5 or 6 years and then trying to hand that off to other people so we can go explore something else that nobody else is exploring, and capitalize on the fact that we're a nonprofit with independent funding that doesn't care if we fail, which means we got to take on big things that maybe have a low probability, but if they happen, they can have a transformative impact. And that's what we like to do. And we're just sort of figuring out the next step on that. But anyway, I took way too long to answer your question. But that's kind of our journey and what I'm enthusiastic about and where I think we're going and that kind of thing.
No, you definitely didn't take too long to answer. When I look at the work that you've been doing, John, who I love dearly, our good colleague, and Matthew's incredible in terms of his work and the lens that he brings to his work, as well as all the folks across the country that are diving deep on employee ownership. I think it's tragic that the pension funds didn't bite. I think it's tragic that when you look at the Canadian Employee Ownership Coalition, the work that John is like the institutional investors should have, like when you look at, I won't name the pension fund, but there's one that invested in crypto and lost a lot of money. So I'm saying that there's been riskier bets than betting on employee ownership. So I think that the public policy framework is incredible. Obviously, it looks like there's going to be, but I'm not going to talk about politics right now in this conversation, but the fact remains that I think the public policy route is a good route, but I feel like we still have to continue to literally attack the pension funds because they are the stewards of the wealth of 99%. We can't leave them off.
That may be where the regulation comes. One of the ideas we're looking at is, one of the powerful forces in the U.S. and some similar things in Europe. But in the U.S., there was a Community Reinvestment Act that forced financial institutions to invest in communities where they'd put red lines through because they said, oh, these are economically deprived communities. We're not going to invest there. And said, you're not going to get your license unless you do that. And here's some parameters around that. Well, I personally think we need a Canadian complexity of that. I don't know if we're the right organization. We got to do a lot of research in that. But and it's a little bit my belief that instead of cozying up to these large institutions and saying, look, we'll give you, this is a great opportunity. And I was about to say, I don't want to be too negative. Actually, I do, but they gave us, it wasn't like they dismissed us or not, that they thought that they said, this is a very credible, this is great what you've done with Taylor Guitars, but they just said, well, bring us deals. And we said, look, it was a fluke we won that one. We won it without committed capital. We were competing against people with committed capital. We just happened to have a long enough runway in Taylor Guitars and business owners who really loved what Social Capital Partners was trying to do because they were two hippies who were 19 and 21 when they started Taylor Guitars, and they're now 65 and 67. And they think the economy should be owned and operated this way. So they wanted to be our poster child for this. But we said, no pension funds, you've got to commit the capital in advance to allow someone to go in and compete for these opportunities with committed capital, not bring you deals when it, but they just said, well, we don't sort of operate that way. And we've got our own, infrastructure in here. We don't want to pay, a fund manager to do, and you go, this is a huge opportunity for you. This is a chance to change, I just wish, it's a failure of imagination on their part. And that goes for our banks too. Our banks and corporate finance, they don't have an affordable housing area. It's like, you guys should be using your creativity. It's not just the government's job. In the US, because of the Community Reinvestment Act, you get this creative financing where, in effect, investment bankers, but community investment bankers figure out, we could get some capital like from foundations or donors that will take a lower return that allows us to then find more conventional finance that'll take, needs a risk-adjusted rate return, but all of a sudden can make affordable housing opportunities work. Our banks show none of that initiative so yeah, get me on these subjects. I go on rants. I, probably take too long, and but I think there's real opportunity there.
There's definitely opportunity, and this is why I wanted to engage this conversation. When you think about the Community Investment Act I think it was like in 1977. And there's a whole bunch of civil rights leaders that fought for that. That's what created the first CDFIs, community development
Yes, it
financial
created the first
state.
CDFIs.
Exactly. And when you look at the landscape in Canada, you have indigenous financial institutions, IFIs, rural communities, have community futures associations. Even if you look at the Quebec Consortium, in terms of the social economy in Quebec, all that came out of that. But funny enough, there's Canadian banks that commits to those same regulations in the States, but don't commit to it in Canada. So it is a regulatory framework issue. And the last thing I'll say on that is, when thinking about these large institutional investors and pension funds, and the fact that you're willing to do the free research and development, R&D for them, they also want you to do market developments and market making and create a pipeline for the deals. That's just the epitome of greed to me.
It's the epitome of just, as I say, a failure of imagination of, because it wouldn't cost them much. And it's what they should be doing. They're the stewards of the wealth of the 99%. Like, wakey is what. And in all our conversations, I found exactly one person, and we could get in at senior levels. That's one of the things just luckily we can do in Canada. We don't have as many connections in the US, but we could. And so we met with very senior people at the Maple 8, at almost all the Maple 8, which is the name for the 8 largest pension funds in Canada that control like trillions of dollars. And we always got sort of a warm reception, but I got exactly one meeting I can remember where one person said, "Holy bleep, this is exactly what we should be doing." Now, that person didn't have enough. He said, "I can't influence. I will connect you to all the right people here, but boy, oh boy." But that's the only person whose imagination went, "Wow, this is just this is exactly what we, anyway." So anyway, it's maybe we have to push them with a Community Reinvestment Act, a Canadian equivalent. So who knows where we're going to go next, but that's, one of the possibilities that we'll be thinking about. And there will be others around this theme of where can we social capital partners have, find a lever that we uniquely have some capabilities that we might be able to pull or push that could have transformative impact, and that nobody else is working on, because unlike most nonprofits, we can afford to fail. We don't mind failing, in the sense of it doesn't stop our funding, or it doesn't stop our, we don't have to make it look like we're a success, or so we can take on stuff that nobody else can take on, and that's what we like to do.
I love it, sir. Incredible. So this is my second last question. What is your ultimate goal, and what does success look like to you and your colleagues?
Wow. Yeah, well, I'm often fond of saying, I never look at success as success, and I never look at failure as failure. I think it steps on a journey to say, how do we end up with a very different economy in terms of the way, who owns it, and how it's operated. And so, because things are, I don't look at not getting, the $1 billion fund off the ground as failure. I don't really look at getting the legislation that we got in Canada and the incentives as success, because we're going to get the pension funds to invest in this stuff, and we're going to get better legislation, and we're going to, so these are just learning opportunities on a journey towards saying back to those existential questions, to getting solutions to that. We don't happen to be working on the climate change one. We do happen to be working on the wealth inequality one. And success, I don't know that there's a final end stop on success. It is pushing the envelope and continually pushing the envelope in a way that moves us inexorably in that direction. That's what success is. But it's also failure, because we fail on a lot of those things along the route. But we're going.
Indeed. And as you said, it's not failure. Those are lessons learned that build upon the momentum, the movements.
Yeah.
Yeah. So So my last question, do you have any closing thoughts or calls to action for our listeners and our viewers?
Well, just I love the idea of finding a way to get engaged in stuff. Um, uh, I think the world is it can be depressing for many of us right now, and it's sometimes hard to not just disengage, just because it seems sometimes futile. And I think the real thing is find your community, because we all have to, inspiration, I think, comes from other people who, anytime I start to flag or start to say, oh, I'm tired, I meet someone who's doing something incredible and it gets me going again, like, okay, this is, and so just make sure you're hanging out with the right people that are, providing you the right kind of energy for you to find something to engage in that can help move, on this path that we all should be trying to move on to make this, a better place for everybody. And that's, it sounds a little too esoteric or too, but anyway.
No, not at all, sir. Not at all. It's actually in alignment with, I think, a lot of the people that's really hold near and dear to real values that impact people on the margins and the periphery of the economy, and the Canadians that are in need of meaningful, tangible solutions to some pervasive problems. So once again, I just give thanks for your consistent leadership, your solidarity, your candor, your authenticity, and your clear passion for this work. Like, I mean, like, I love it, and the fact that you still have this the tenacity and resilience around this is just truly remarkable. So once again, I just appreciate you for all that you do for so many. And as always, at Setsi, we'll close the way we began this conversation, this interview, by giving thanks to our creator, by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we're on and giving thanks to them, by acknowledging, giving thanks to our ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We give thanks to all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you so much, Bill. I so appreciate you, sir.
Likewise, Victor. Cheers. Talk